All right, the purpose of this presentation, we're going over assessment literacy and how we use it with interactive achievement. We know that we're really big on creating our own assessments and creating those assessments that are aligned with the standards. So, in going over this presentation, we kind of just want to make sure that when we're creating those,
could you call the office, please, Ms. Crump?
when we're creating those assessments, we're not just picking random questions based on the standard. We're actually making sure that the cognitive level and what we want from the test that we're creating is aligned with the standard. So our purpose is to create an assessment on interactive achievement that is cognitively aligned with the standard. If the standard is on a remembering level as far as Bloom's taxonomy, we don't want to be testing them at a creating level. We want to have it on the same cognitive level as it's written in the standard. And also we are going to be able to plot our assessments by question and cognitive level using a table of specifications. And the table of specifications should sound familiar because we did, a pretty extensive PD in the beginning of the school year on using our assessments to align. Okay, the success criteria. At the end of this PD, you should be able to identify the verb and in a standard, identify the cognitive level in a standard, create an interactive achievement assessment based on the standard, and then plot your assessment using a table of specifications. And that table of specifications will be your snapshot to tell you whether or not your assessment is aligned or if you need to add or subtract some things and where you need to go from there. So my first question that I'm going to ask of you, how well do you know how to check an IA assessment for alignment? If you know absolutely nothing, you're going to select 1 and hit send. If you're pretty much in the middle, you know enough, you could work through it, but you wouldn't feel comfortable teaching it to someone, you're going to select 3. And if you could do it and teach others. Question. When creating an assessment on interactive achievement, I read each question before adding it to my test. Simple, true or false question. I read each question before I add it to my test. Next question. When creating an assessment on IA, I plot my final assessment using the table of specifications. And remember, that's that table that we used in the beginning of the school year. When creating an assessment on IA, I plot my final assessment using a table of specifications. True or false?
Step 5 takes us into what do students need to know, what do they need to be able to do to demonstrate that they're meeting or approaching mastery of the standard. If you look at that very first item, it's a vocabulary item. What's the meaning of the word adversariate as it's used in paragraph 21 of the passage from Byron's Winter? In step 5, we really look at what are the standards and evidences that are being measured. There are actually 2 standards being measured, RL4 and L4. Now ask yourself, what do the students need to know to be able to answer the item?
If they would have to know how to use context and how to go back to the text.
With step 5, we're really looking at the task and asking what students need to really know and understand, and then how would they apply and synthesize that knowledge and understanding.
We actually got to align the questions that were asked for the text to the standards. So what I learned from that process, I'm able to figure out how to create my own questions back in the classroom so that I can align the standards to the questions that I'm asking of my students as well.
An exciting moment happened in working with the middle school team and looking at an item around summary. The item itself asks for students to take a series of statements and to choose 4 of those statements to drag and drop into a box in sequence to create an objective summary.
The first thing they have to learn is what do you actually see from these choices that actually is in the text.
we talked about what would be involved in such an activity. And we agreed that part of what students need to know and be able to do is to understand what's the difference between an objective summary and a non-objective summary. What does that mean to be objective? Not an I believe this is what's important about the text, but this is what the text says, and here's the order that it says it, and these are the most important ideas, the most salient points. And that ability to abstract from a text is such a critical college and career ready skill.
It's multidisciplinary.
Yes.
Your science teacher has
Yes.
to, your social science
Everybody
teacher
has
has
to
to,
be on board,
you know,
too.
that's going to reinforce a skill that they can take to any test.
In order for students to be able to be successful, they really had to have that understanding of the story structure, the text structure, and also character development, and how characters have struggles and conflicts with themselves and those around them, and how those struggles cause them to grow and change and evolve over time.
So as far as what I learned from that process, I'm able to figure out how to create my own questions back in the classroom so that I can align the standards to the questions that I'm asking of my students as well.
Okay, what are some things that you heard the teachers say about alignment in the standard?
Well, it seems as though she needed to know what the standard was and understand how it might need to be presented to the students so that they could show their understanding.
Right. The whole purpose of assessment alignment is looking at that standard and creating a test that speaks directly to that standard. You want to be able to test those students on their ability to basically compute what the standard is asking. If the standard is asking you to assess their ability to read a bar graph and you want them to draw a bar graph, you're not really assessing what the standard is asking. So we want to be sure that we're creating assessments that speak to what the standard wants. So just to review, I'm not sure if you'll remember in September, but we went over the purpose of assessments in the classroom, especially in reference to the table of specifications. And we came to the conclusion that poorly made assessments lead to erroneous inferences. If I'm creating an assessment on bar graphs once again, and I'm testing them on line plots, and I'm sitting here like, no one passed this test. Would that give you a clear understanding of their understanding of bar graphs? No, not at all. So, creating an assessment that is aligned to the standard means that you are able to take action and provide feedback based on their understanding of that standard. So, what is our table of specifications? A quick review. It's basically a blueprint for what should be included. As you can see here, you put your content. So this would be the standard. The student will write numbers up to 6 digits. The student will read a bar graph. The student will interpret information. So that's what goes in our content section. And then we address it by cognitive level. If they are to read a bar graph, is that at the remembering stage? Is that at the understanding stage? So that gives us a quick glimpse as to the content as well as what cognitive level we should be asking that question on.
And we would just put a check in the box.
We'll get to that in a second. Awesome
Okay.
question.
Okay.
So why do we use the table of specifications? Once again, it makes sure that your test is aligned. It makes sure that what the standard wants is what you're teaching. What the standard wants is what you're assessing them on. I would not expect a student to score 100 on a test on line plots if I've taught bar graphs all week. So we take the content, we add the cognitive level in there, and that's how we get our intended learning outcomes. Okay? That's how we get what we expect those students to take from the standard based on how it's written. So our first example, I'm gonna walk us through this one. 3rd grade skill. I picked this one for Dr. Lee. So bar graphs. First 9-week skill. The student will construct a line plot a picture graph or a bar graph. And we're focusing on bar graphs this week. So I think that's in the first 1 or 2 weeks, right, Dr. Lee?
Yeah.
Right. So we would merely be focusing on the bar graph aspect. So they are to label each axis on a bar graph and give the bar graph a graph title. In this sentence, label each axis on a bar graph. What's the verb in this section? Label. So I would circle my label and then use my questioning ring that I've asked you all to bring to assess what cognitive level it's on, okay? And I would go through and do that for each one of my bullets. So let's say I have my standard, I've gone through, I've circled all my verbs, I've identified all of the cognitive levels, and I come up with something that looks a little like this, okay? So I've gone through, circled each verb. Is it starting to look familiar, Ms. Williams? I circled each verb, went through my questioning ring, and identified each verb by the cognitive level, okay? So now I know when I'm pulling questions for labeling a bar graph and giving it a title, I need to be pulling questions that are on the remembering levels. I know that when I'm pulling questions about reading information on a simple bar graph, I need to be pulling questions that are on the remembering level. And the amazing thing about interactive achievement is they give you the cognitive level. Thank you, interactive achievement. So you go through each and every standard, substandard, and you identify that verb. So I know that I need to be pulling questions where students are having to select a correct interpretation of a graph, okay? And it even gets a little deeper at some point, I think. Yep, where one is correct and the remaining are incorrect. So I'm going to be looking specifically for questions on this level, on the application level. So the R would be the remembering level, U is understand, AP is applying. So when you're doing it, if you want to write out remembering, that's fine. If you want to write out understanding, completely fine. But for short purposes, I just use abbreviation. And then I take my content, and you also have this in your packet if you want to look on the paper copy as well. I went through and I basically put a little blurb about each of my little bullets. So here where it says label each axis on the bar graph and give it a title, my first row, label and title the bar graph. And remember, we identified it as the remembering cognitive level. So I just made this box in bold. You can highlight it, you can put squigglies around it, whatever helps you identify it, okay? So I went through and I did that for all 4 of my standards. So at the end, you should have something that looks like this. So this is what you'll use when you're creating your assessments. You should know that I'm going to look for questions where I'm identifying parts of data with the special characteristics, and I want to make sure that I'm doing that at the understanding level. For instance, I went in and I decided to go ahead and create my test. Okay? So I went in interactive achievement, created your new test. Don't forget you have to put your prefix, TAR, dash your grade, dash what kind, dash what you're testing. I pick my exam category. It's a quiz. And we all know that our computers can be slow at times. You have to drill down until you get to the Tarrant folder. Don't forget to put it in the Tarrant folder. That makes it so much easier to find when we're looking for it. You go down, you pick your grade level, and then you create. So I'm assessing SOL 3.17. I can go down to SOL 3.17, open it up, 3.17b, and I'll just start picking random questions, right? I can just start picking random questions to put on my test.
No.
Yeah, I mean, it's 3.17b and c. I could just, pick random questions, put on my test. Go up to the exam menu, go ahead, submit and approve it. I'm good, right?
No.
I went through and I created my assessment. And here's a copy of my assessment. Now let's remember, you have your paper copy. I'm assessing what for 3.17?
Bar graph.
Bar graphs. What's the problem with this? It's a graph.
It's not
It's
a
a
bar
line
graph.
or
It's a
a
line
line.
plot.
Right, I'm assessing bar graphs. That's the problem that a lot of people run into. They just see 3.17b. Oh, I'll just pick random questions and they'll all align. So the problem with this one is, we're assessing bar graphs, not line plots. So that's one of the first reasons we want to actually read each and every question before we put it on our test, because you can run into problems such as this.
It doesn't have two axes.
It doesn't have two axes. There are so many things wrong with this question and so many reasons why it's not aligned. All right, what about this one? The bar graph shows the number of votes for each type of cookie. They're asking which statement is true. There are 4 statements, and they just want to know which one is true. Aligned? Yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down?
Yes.
Yes. Why do you say yes, Ms. Crump?
Because it is asking them to analyze the information in the graph, and that was 3.1c, where they had to apply to interpret the statements.
Exactly. It specifically said to pick one true statement out of the 4. We're assessing that, correct?
Yeah.
So would this be a good question to have on our quiz?
Yes.
So we're selecting a correct interpretation, and that's part of what one of the standards has asked us to do. Next question. Fran is making this graph. She collected a number of students, and they want us to pick a label for the bar graph and place it on line 1. Okay? They want us to label an axis. Was this one of our standards?
Yes.
Yes. Specifically said, label the axis. So this is a really good question to have on your quiz, because it's asking the student to do exactly what this standard wants us to do.
Mm-hmm.
So Elm Elementary, they're once again picking the statement that best describes the data above. Aligned? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes. Why do you say yes?
Because again, they're picking a statement that is basically true about the graph. They have to analyze the information that is presented.
Right. They're analyzing the data. They're picking out the special characteristics of the assessment, and that's what they've asked us to do. And last but not least, which type of cookie received the most votes? So they're asking the students to read the graph, find that cookie that received the most votes. So they want us to pull out the special characteristic that describes this bar graph. Aligned? Yes, no? Yes. So once we've gone through and we've looked at each one of our test questions, you're going to plot the number of the test question in the appropriate box. So for instance, I have a 3 here, label entitled the bar graph. Let's go back to question number 3. That question is asking me to label the bar graph, okay? So that's why the number 3 gets placed in this box here, okay? So you would do that for each and every question. So I went through and I noticed that all 4 of these questions, I actually had to read the bar graph before I answered the question. But what do we notice about question number 1, looking at this table?
It's not clear.
Is not there. So, should that question even be on my assessment? No. And that's the good thing about these tables of specification. It gives you a blueprint and kind of a snapshot of your assessment and what questions you have that you should move around. If I had a table of specifications and all of my questions landed in this box, what does that tell me about the reliability of my test? If they're all asking questions about selecting and interpreting the graph.
Doesn't really tell you if the students can do the other things the standard
Exactly.
does.
It's only assessing one standard. And we're doing 4 this week, okay? So we can't really rely on this test to really test or assess what our students have learned throughout the week. So, we're going to do one together. This is SOL 4.4, 4th grade skill, where students are adding and subtracting whole numbers. Now realize the standard itself is adding, subtracting, and multiplying whole numbers. So we could run into the problem of picking a question that's multiplying. So the students are going to determine the sum or difference, and you also have this on your packet as well. Determining the sum or difference of two whole numbers, each 999,999 or less. And the students are also going to solve single-step and multi-step problems using whole numbers and operations. But don't forget, we're focusing on adding and subtracting. So on your next slide, you have an activity where I'm asking you to circle the verb and identify it by cognitive level. And I've also given you a little key up in the top corner. Okay, seems like everyone is ready. So I'm going to pick one to share, and you'll be able to see it on your screen as well. Got it? Everybody can see it?
Yes.
Ms. Shears, can you walk us through why you chose the applying cognitive level for the first standard?
They're using the skill and applying it to solve the problems, and the verbs. Some other verbs are show, illustrate, use, examine.
Right. So when Ms. Shears was thinking this through, she thought about what are we asking students to do when they're applying something. And some of the other verbs are actually very helpful. If you're looking at the verbs around it on your questioning ring, solve, determine, show,
Yeah,
right?
show.
Mm-hmm. So when you're doing all of those things, you're determining the sum or difference. So that's a good way to think it through. Now, on another note, for instance, if you'll remember, in the beginning of the school year, when we were doing this activity, for some of the standards, when we were doing this as a whole, some people had one cognitive level and some people had another. There is a little wiggle room when it comes to cognitive levels because of how you are processing it. Ms. Crump, why did you choose evaluate over apply?
I chose evaluate because determine, the actual verb, was under evaluate, but I put the question mark there because based on the rest of this, what the rest of the standard states, they're not really evaluating anything. They're just choosing the correct answer after they've solved, which is applying.
Right. So that's why it's always good to not just look at the card and say, oh, there's determine, under evaluate. I'll just pick that. Actually thinking about what it means when you're evaluating something, what it means when you're applying something or remembering something or creating something or analyzing something. So it's important that, like Ms. Crump did, she read the entire standard so that you get a full understanding of what exactly they're asking for.
And that evaluate, when we go back and we ask our children to justify or tell them why they're doing that.
Yeah, they have to explain it. Yeah.
They're
Excellent
taking
point.
the skills and they're using them, so that's applying.
Yeah. Excellent point. Okay, so here's what I came up with when I did it. Applying and applying, kind of for the same reason. You're taking the skill and you're actually applying it to the question that they're asking. You're actually applying it to the word problem. Okay, now we're going to take it to the next step. Using your paper, you're going to write in the content for each standard, and then you can click on the highlight tool to actually highlight the box for the cognitive level, like we did on this chart. When I wrote in the content and then I made this box bold, that's what I want you to do. Just fill in the content and then box in the proper cognitive level for that content.
I'm one of the teachers who did not know about the alignment and the specification. I'll be honest. What I would do, and I think it was more like a time frame for me to get this done to these kids. Sometimes I would open it in the morning, but was not making sure it was aligned. I was just clicking and just clicking and pulling those to get at least 10 to 12. But now I get it. You have to read each one and align it with the test questions. Am I saying that right? For your student, and I learned something today. So now I know when I go and create a test that I would have to sit there, walk through it, read it, make sure it goes with the skill of. So now I'm glad I came in here because I learned something today. And I was wondering, like you all say, well, she hasn't learned yet. I'm sitting up there like, oh gosh, I'm one of the ones that just like, I learned, ladies. I learned today how to create my test.
It is very helpful.
Wilson.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realize that.
I think that was me.
Sorry.
Thank you, Miss. I learned how to.
Yeah, it's very helpful because in the beginning, I'll be honest, I was doing the same thing. Like I was just assuming I mean it's 3.17C. I just
what I was doing.
Pull questions,
That's what it.
or even just pick randomly select questions. But for this specific reason is why I have stopped doing that, because you'll create it and then assign it, and then you'll have kids raising their hand like, but we haven't learned about this yet. And I'm like, oh, well, can't count that question. So it can be time consuming, but the end product is worth it.
And I did a social studies test today.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the questions that I pulled, I was like, why did I pull? And the students were at the screen, and I knew they were struggling, and I was struggling with them because I was trying to figure out why did I use this question for this test.
Mm-hmm.
Then I said, you know what, boys and girls, just do your best, and I would go, we are not going to use this as a test, because I realized I was, and they had pictures. I was like, what is this picture that I pulled for? It was the Lakota Indians.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Like
all.
yeah.
It was all wrong. Yes, I learned my lesson today.
So let's say I went in and I created my quiz again for this standard. Remember, we're always putting in our prefix and your grade. Drill down all the way to Tarrant, putting it in that Tarrant folder so that we can find it, and also identifying it by your grade levels as well. But this time I took a little more care when I created my test and I drilled down. So as you can see, I'm going to go down and actually pick a question and read the question before I put it on my test. You can see it also tells you the Bloom's taxonomy level there as well. Okay, so that was a good question. I'm going to pick that one. I'm going to actually read through the word problem to make sure that it's asking what I want it to ask. That's a multi-step problem, so that was a good one. I'm going to pick that one. And then I say, you know what? I think I'll just pick some more random questions because I don't want to read any more questions. So I'll just throw those last two up there.
Haven't learned your lesson.
Clearly, I have not learned my lesson just yet. Okay, I'm going to share Ms. Crumps.
Hi.
Ms. Crump, can you walk us through your table of specifications, por favor?
Sure. Well, number one was a word problem where students had to add and subtract. It was multi-step, so I put that in the solve multi-step one under apply. Number two is a word problem, and it's single step, but it addresses multiplication.
Yeah, you know this.
So I just put a big 2 and crossed that out because it just didn't work with what we were trying to assess. It is 4.4, but it's not addition and subtraction.
Right.
3 and 4 were the same thing, multi-step word problems, and then 5 was the only one that was just straight up sum and difference. So, yeah.
So, as you can see, we have 2. Our friend down here, he's not on our assessment. 1, 3, and 4 are here, and 5 is in that box. So, what are some observations you have made based on the information in that table? So I'll go back here and I'll freeze it so you can have them do it. What are some observations that you can draw from our assessment? Look at each content and look at the number of questions that are asked based on the content. All right, Ms. Shears, can you share your thoughts on our assessment?
Sure. I said that they're looking at the table. There were 3. Yeah, there were 3. They could, 3 questions that were on the multi-step level, and only 1 question that was single step. So I thought that there should maybe be a couple more single steps on there.
Right. Because I think, Ms. Crump, can you share, I liked your wording as well. Can you share your observation?
I put that it was, you had a lot more questions on the solving standard and not determining. So I said if students miss those questions, want to repeat it?
Yes, please.
I put that students were tested heavily on the solve and not determine questions. So if they miss the solving questions, you can't really judge whether they don't really understand adding and subtracting, or if they really don't understand the word problems because you didn't give them enough adding and subtracting to see if they can just do that.
Right. Very good observation.
What I was trying to say, that I noticed that it was 1, 3, and 4, and that those choices were used the most for the application part under the solve. And so I don't know if they were choices, but they were used. That's what I was trying to say.
Right.
They were used.
And we know that when we're creating our assessments, we would have far more than just 5 questions, but you want to make sure that you're equally assessing each standard, because like Ms. Crump pointed out, if I do really, really poorly on the solving part, but on the word problem part, but I do really well on the word problem, and you only give me 1 word problem, that's not going to really give you a fair assessment as to whether or not they truly understand word problems, if they just pick the correct answer that time. So it's important that you share the wealth when you're creating your assessments as far as your standards go. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to you. You have 2 options. I have on Google Drive, I've shared with you a electronic copy, but you also have a paper copy. You are going to access your drive or turn to your page in your packet. And you're basically going to go through what we did today. You're going to fill in the skill, identify each verb in a cognitive level. You're going to fill in your table of specifications with your content. And then you're just going to create a mini 5-question IA quiz based off of that table of specifications. And then you're going to plot it and then give me some reflections based on your assessment that you've created. And let's see your packet. When you reflect, you're going to be thinking about what was maybe the most difficult part of this process. Are there some things that you still need a little assistance on? How would this help you when you take it back to the classroom? So that's what we're going to break off and do. Okay, so on your screen, we're just going to do a little post follow-up assessment with yourself based on what we have gone over today. So our first question now is, how well do you know how to check for an IA assessment for alignment?
Training.
It's training. Yes. Because I was doing it all through.
Now, true or false? When creating an assessment on IA, I select questions merely based on the SOL number. Do you find yourself still doing that? True or false? I just look at the SOL number and I pick a question. Next question. When creating an assessment on interactive achievement, I read each question before adding it to my test.
I will for now. Yes, that's a big yes. No, true.
True or false? When creating an assessment on interactive achievement, I plot my final assessment using a table of specifications. All right, as your exit ticket, at the bottom of your paper, I would like for you to write one way you can use this information that you received today in the classroom. One way. That's your exit ticket for today. And before you all leave, I just want to say thank you for agreeing to participate in my presentation. I really hope and pray that you learned something that you can use in your classroom, and that if you have any further questions, I'm right here in room 8, so just stop on by or shoot me an email.